And welcome to Small Biz Matters. We are proudly broadcasting from the COSBOA Small Business Summit, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming John Price, who's the head of ASIC. Thank you so much for joining us and talking to your small business audience this morning.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
It's a great summit, and I think it's fantastic to see we've got all the policy makers, we've got the decision makers, we've got the heads of government department all in one place. Mm-hmm. Why is it so important that ASIC is part of this conference and is here to talk to small businesses directly and to one another?
Well, look, our small business strategy is really around assisting small business, engaging with small business and helping to protect small business. So for us, we see this as a key opportunity to engage with people in the small business community, to explain what we do, how we can make a difference and get their feedback on how we can improve as well.
Now, ASIC is a very important role in small business. You are a regulatory authority and you obviously look after our business structures and the way that we operate on a day-to-day level. Beyond that, what does ASIC do to support small business other than administering it?
Yeah, so look, I think there are a couple of really important things, maybe three I'll call out this morning. The first is, as I said before, we provide very important guidance to small business, how to navigate some of the laws that we administer. So, for example, last year, we took 670,000 calls in our registry function. So that's the area that registers companies and business names, and the vast majority of those 670,000 interactions were really helping small business. We've got a small business app that's been downloaded 15,000 times. We've got a lot of guidance both on our website but also on ASIC's MoneySmart website, which can help people understand what they need to do to get a successful business up and running. So that's the engagement piece. The second piece is around making business registrations easier, and we've worked with other government agencies to set up a website, business.gov.au. Through that website, you can get a number of registrations. There's information there about taxation, risk management, registering business. On average, it takes less than 15 minutes to get a variety of registrations through that website. Really strongly encourage listeners out there to go and check that website out. And then the final thing that we try and do is we try and work with larger businesses to try and streamline things that might be causing small businesses angst. So recently, we've worked with the large banks to remove a number of terms in loan agreements that people might think are unfair. So in summary, we provide guidance, we try and make our registration processes as simple as possible, and we work with larger businesses so they don't forget some of the challenges that small businesses are facing.
Now, one of the things you mentioned in the panel this morning was all about the fact that not all red tape is in government and that you're also working with business systems to make the system fairer and less compliance heavy.
Yeah.
Can you give me a couple of practical examples where it does make it easier for the everyday business?
Yeah, so one I just mentioned before, it's around unfair contract terms in loan agreements. And
that's the banks, isn't it?
That's larger banks or financiers. So there used to be, for example, terms in many loan contracts that said the loan contract is the entire agreement, and any other discussions you had with your bank manager or anybody else, they didn't form part of the agreement. And we got people to change those. There were other examples where, for example, banks could unilaterally change the terms of the loan contract
midway through.
And we've got those watered down. So that's one example. The other example is we have worked with the larger banks. People have signed up to what's called the Banking Code of Conduct, and there are a range of extra protections in that Code of Conduct for small business that go beyond what's required in the law. So we've actually worked with Kate Carnell's office, the Small Business Ombudsman, and the banks to get those extra protections in place. So that's just a couple of ways that we're working with business so that small business is not forgotten and they get a better deal.
Now, small business funding is very much topical at the moment. We've just had the Banking Royal Commission. We've had, ASBFIO looking at the funding guide that they've released with Scottish Pacific. There's a lot of support out there. But I wanted to ask you, the head of the AFCA, Jeff Brown, just mentioned before about the fact that fintech companies don't actually need to be members of AFCA. That's a growing funding offer that's there for small business. If we've got a whole group of people who are offering small business lending and they're not regulated, or they're not we're not protected from them, isn't that a huge shortfall and risk for small business?
Well, look, what I would say is that there are a group of these fintech lenders who've signed up to a voluntary code of conduct. And so if I were a small business and I was shopping around, I would be asking people that question to see whether they've signed up to the voluntary code of conduct. I mean, as regards other, whether it's a legal requirement or not, that's really a question for governments and Parliament rather than necessarily ASIC. But,
is that something that you would push for? Would you like to see that happen?
Well, look, I think there are a range of considerations that are there. It's certainly important to make sure those protections are there. At the same time, if there are extra requirements, it might cut down the amount of credit that's available to small business. So it's a bit of a balancing act. But as I say, it's really a question for government.
That's understandable. Now, one of the things I was sensing in the room was a bit of a disconnect between the policy drivers and the small business community, who's kind of in the back seat and not really having much control over things. You mentioned the MoneySmart program, which is a great opportunity for businesses to really understand where they stand with their money.
Yeah.
What other support mechanisms have you got in place at ASIC that people can access on an everyday level?
Okay, great question. So there are three I'm going to mention. There's the MoneySmart program that's really focusing on financial capability, giving people the tools they need to be able to run their business and understand investments. So that's quite important. ASIC's own website has a wealth of material about small business, and that includes guidance. In addition to ASIC's website, there's the business.gov.au website that I've mentioned as well. And the final thing I'd say is, if you've got a small business, you've got a question about registration of companies, registration of business names, you've read the guidance, you don't know who else to turn to, you've still got unanswered questions, ring us. We take, as I say, there's 670,000 client interactions we have a year for our registry, and the team there is very experienced, very knowledgeable, and hopefully they'll be able to set you straight.
Now, I've got a question coming from one of my colleagues at the Hornsby Chamber of Commerce. He's an accountant and he wants to ask something on behalf of a few of his clients. Where does my $254 go each year? Okay,
so look, there are yearly fees in terms of registering a company. But what's important to know is those fees are actually set out in law. So there are some regulations that say what those fees have got to be. And ASIC, what we do is we collect that fee and then we give that money straight to government. So it's not actually money that we get and use. Really, we're collecting it and then it goes in a consolidated revenue for government.
And who determines the late fee process and cost?
My recollection is that's actually set out in the regulations. So it's not something we just make up.
In the community, the ATO obviously has tax agents and BAS agents as their support mechanism and people who can really understand and answer the questions. Yep. Who are your bastions in the community that people can turn to for help? Yeah, that's a great question as well. As I say, if people want to do things themselves and they need help, then you're welcome to call our helplines. But a lot of people do use what are known as registered agents, and these typically tend to be accountants, sometimes lawyers, and they act as an intermediary, if you like, between the person who's lodging company documents or business name documents and ASIC. So that's quite a common feature in the Australian business. And an accountant needs to be registered with ASIC to provide those services. So that goes beyond being a tax agent. Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's an agreement that ASIC has with the person who's providing those services. Well, that's fantastic. You've really covered a lot of information here. There's great places that small businesses can go to if they need support. And it's nice to know that ASIC, there is actually a contact centre that we can call. You take how many calls a year? So 670,000 client contacts a year. Not all of those are calls. We have web chat as well. We have facilities for email inquiries to come in too. And it sounds like you're trying to make yourselves more available and more accessible. Absolutely. Well, thank you for making yourself accessible to Small Biz Matters here at the COSBOA Conference. We're reporting live from COSBOA 2019, which is a business summit between policy drivers, policy makers and small business community. Thank you so much for joining us today. My pleasure. Thank you.